Good morning, everybody. I'm John OLoughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning we are continuing our reading. This is part 6 of the book A Law Unto Itself by Nancy Lisagor and Frank Lipsius, the untold story of the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. And we have made it into chapter 6, a few pages of the book. Let's see. And good morning to you guys, and hello to everyone who's watching the replay on Facebook or YouTube. And thanks for being with us. Indulge me a minute because I think I lost my page. Okay, here we are. If you remember now, the last time we were together last Monday, Alan Dulles had been, he's a 20-something young man in Cologne, Germany, making a deal or trying to make a deal for clients named Merton, the Merton brothers, a company called Metallgesellschaft. And the whole thing starts to fall through as the German government is falling and uh, the Ruhr revolt is breaking out. And Dulles is defeated in his attempt to drum up some business. Having completed no work for the firm, Dulles managed to make himself $10,000 on the way home. Bernard Baruch, with whom Dulles had served on the War Trade Board and who had attended the Versailles negotiations, approached him through Cromwell to ghostwrite a book on the Versailles Treaty, which Baruch assured him would take only about 2 weeks. Baruch was a speculator who used his fortune to buy influence and reputation. Having made a stock market killing on a tip that America had destroyed the Spanish fleet to win the Spanish-American War, he hovered around the powerful with the look of a do-gooder while hiding the manipulative skill he learned in smoke-filled back rooms. Dorothy Parker once said that two things confused her, quote, the theory of the zipper and the exact function of Bernard Baruch. I'll stop for a moment and say I think studying Bernard Baruch is something that we need to do more of as well. He got inside information about the defeat of the Spanish fleet. Where did he get it from? You know, an interesting man. If you look at his bio, and it is worth a trip over to Wikipedia or some other somewhat reliable source to at least get the basic facts. Born in Camden, South Carolina. No, he's not a European Jew. He's a Jew from South Carolina. And that his mother was a daughter of the Confederacy. So it's one of the two amazing religious connections to the Confederacy that are seldom talked about. Number one, Catholicism. You know, Scarlett O'Hara's dad, right? For a mythical, but really, you know, the Carroll family and all of the Catholic support for the South and the slave system is not talked about, and then the Jewish support in view of course, financing and the existing investments, as we've documented in many ways here at McDuff Lives. You will recall simply the great railroads investments that are fueling the economic growth of the South in the 1840s and 50s. Well, the Southern attitude of Baruch is not apparent unless you take a moment and think about that he might actually have a lot in common with an Allen Dulles, not because of European connections, but because of American connections. As a member of the Reparations Committee at the Versailles negotiations, Baruch felt compelled to counter the devastating criticism of John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who had quit Versailles because of its punitive provisions against Germany. On his way to Europe, Dulles had read Keynes's new bestseller, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which disturbed him as much as it did Baruch. While still in London before going to the continent, Dulles had written a letter to the Times of London, which published it in nearly 2 full columns of the paper. In answer to Keynes's complaint that Wilson had betrayed the principles on which he promised Germany peace, Dulles replied that Wilson should not have been faced with a choice. The French were unreasonable. It was all their fault. In the Times letter, Dulles argued that the Reparations Commission could make amends. Quote, the whole operation is akin to that of a settlement in which the creditors recognize that their own interest lies in preserving and enhancing the economic vitality of the debtor, unquote. But he ignored Keynes's point that unlike relations between a creditor and a debtor, France wanted to destroy Germany in revenge for World War I and the humiliating loss in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. Dulles anonymously wrote, the making of the reparation and economic sections of the treaty, and that's a long title of a publication, in Baruch's name, as an elaboration of the letter. By merely justifying America's actions, Dulles ignored Keynes's main concern about the instability caused by the Treaty of Versailles. The Baruch book looks at an impressive 353 pages, a prodigious achievement on Dulles's cruise back to New York. That's amazing, isn't it? 353 pages, you write it anonymously for somebody else and you accomplish it in a couple of weeks of a cruise. This is the hard thing about the Dulles brothers is that although they seem to be completely blind to a huge portion of what's important in the world and what's important in life, they're still very intelligent men. But it was really only 124 pages of new material, followed by a lightly annotated text of the reparation and economic sections of the treaty and appendices of speeches of delegates in Paris, including Dulles's. Well, I guess that solves the mystery. Having rationalized the peace with Baruch in 1922, it was to him that Dulles confessed in 1945, quote, the reparation creditors had built up within Germany a machinery which was intended to enable Germany to pay reparations, but which, in fact, enabled Germany to wage the most destructive war of all time, unquote. That's something to sit back and think about, isn't it? That this young Allen Dulles participated in setting up the reparations system that, in fact, was would allow Germany to wage the most destructive war of all time. Witnessing 2 revolts in Germany in 2 weeks in no way changed Dulles's opinion that, quote, the Reparation Commission in the process of enforcement might become a flexible instrument of wisdom and justice, unquote. He had no second thoughts about the adventures he had just been through, the hunger, the anti-Semitism, the violent swings of right and left politics. Dulles's partners could not have been too happy to see him return to the office with nothing to show for 2 months of adventure, but Cromwell approved, writing to Dulles, quote, this kind of work is the most effective and far-reaching in the future as well as the present of S&C. It is only a matter of time when you will be called to take a more active part in these great questions. Unquote. Cromwell's confidence was well founded. Though Dulles had gotten nowhere in Europe, in New York he immediately attracted clients with European problems. The New York Life Insurance Company, which had $525 million in policies outstanding abroad, asked Dulles to sort out the immensely complicated results of the war on its business. New York Life had increased its coverage in Europe while other American companies had withdrawn, so that by 1913 it did more than half of all the United States European insurance business. Its policies varied from standard life insurance to endowment policies, which Russians took out at a daughter's birth to guarantee her a dowry. Wow, endowment, endowment, pardon me. Oh, just a second to say hello to guys and ladies and my friends. Jerome is here. Hello, Jerome. Hello, Corky, Taz, Mobster, Karma. Everybody, Leslie's here. Christy, Brightmore, Shouts, Ms. Hunt for free reign, and Laura is here. And everyone else, good morning to you. We have, let's see, 39 people watching on YouTube. I don't have a count for Facebook right now. We only have one thumbs up according to YouTube. If you guys are watching on YouTube, do me a favor, subscribe it and give us a like because it helps spread the channel around, as you know. Isn't it amazing how life insurance companies just pop into these problems? All of a sudden, you think of all the life insurance policies sold in China by the Vander Stars and, selling policies in Russia during the Russian Revolution. I guess there's a lot of money in life insurance, apparently. In 1885, the clever Russian court advisor, Count S.Y. Witte, that's Witte, could be Vita, I'm not sure, had forced American insurance companies to invest their Russian premiums in Russia. New York Life had 20,000 policies worth $40 million in Russian insurance and a comparable investment in Russian bonds and property. In 1918, the Soviets annulled the bonds and confiscated New York Life's property while claiming payment on the policies on behalf of the 20,000 policyholders. The Soviets won a landmark case on the policies in New York State Court, getting a judgment amounting to millions of dollars. Dulles made New York Life settle with the Russians, but the Equitable Life Assurance Company Society appealed and won a reversal. Those cases took 6 years, nothing compared to New York Life's counterclaim for its property confiscated in 1918. In 1931, the Litvinov Accord set aside $9 million of Russian property in the United States for all claimants like New York Life to divide proportionately. The actual distribution occurred 25 years later in 1956. It was a wonderful legal exercise, but economically a total disaster. according to Frederick Zeibold, who rummaged around in New York Life Insurance Company's attic looking for pre-revolutionary Russian documents. It was fascinating as his first assignment at the firm, but the firm lost a lot of money on it. New York Life's claims in Central Europe and Russia were a nagging reminder of the old world which Dulles had helped to bury without necessarily creating a satisfactory replacement. Pardon me. You understand our authors are lamenting, the fact that World War One destroyed the old world order without providing a replacement, and we're looking at Dulles as one of the agents of the continuing demise of civilization in Europe, as opposed to someone who could actually have allowed the reparation system to work as ostensibly intended. When in 1920 the American Bankers Association set up a foreign trade organization with $100 million to bankroll exports to Europe, Dulles claimed a special expertise, quote, as an American member of the Reparations Commission and an American member of the Supreme Economic Council, unquote. He added in a letter to the president of the American Bankers Association, quote, I had perhaps exceptional opportunities to study the financial problems involved in Europe, securing in necessary securing its necessary commodities, unquote. He did not mention his failures when he also wrote about his, quote, recent private trip to Europe, including Central Europe, studying particularly the problem involved in the nation's financing imports from the United States. The bankers were impressed and invited Dulles to a meeting in Chicago. Reviving Europe through private industry was an idea whose time had not yet come. Cautious businessmen would not lend to Europeans while German inflation reached at its height in 1923 a rate of 4.2 billion marks to the dollar, compared with 8 marks to the dollar in 1919. In 1923, France invaded the Ruhr Valley on the pretext of Germany's refusal to deliver coal under the Versailles Treaty, while Germany embarked on a general strike. Dulles could do little work for the bankers then, but their taking notice of him would yield the firm dividends later. In the summer of 1923, some of the biggest industrialists in Germany invited Dulles to defend them after their arrest for refusing to send coal to France. Besides having a good reputation as a lawyer, though he had never tried a case in court, Dulles was useful to the Germans by being able to publicize their predicament abroad. He met his potential clients in the elegant executive quarters adjacent to the Krupp Steel Works, known locally as the Krupp Private Hotel, near Essen. After an elegant and hearty lunch that surprised Dulles for its refinement in the midst of crisis, he asked to see some of the proceedings of the French military tribunal before deciding whether to defend the executives. A mine manager who had transported coal without a French permit had received a fine and a 1-year sentence. A professor accused of propaganda against the Army of Occupation because of a newspaper clipping found in a room next to his had gotten a heavy fine and a 5-year sentence. A French soldier who had carelessly killed another French soldier but blamed a German had gotten a 1-year sentence. Dulles concluded that the trials were, quote, summary affairs. It is part of the general policy to sentence a certain number every day. Under the circumstances, he declined the work, even though, he told the German chancellor, there were admittedly many individual cases of grave injustice which, under those circumstances, I should have liked to help remedy. For a lawyer with no experience, he had a high opinion of his own worth, adding to the chancellor, quote, the situation did not permit of work of a really professional character, and I doubted that I could accomplish any real good. In other words, he didn't know what he was doing. Pardon me. The Chancellor, Wilhelm Kuno, who was head of the Hamburg America shipping line, remember them? Yeah, don't ever forget the Hamburg America shipping line and all the great connections we've made, which Sullivan and Cromwell later represented, pleaded with Dulles to find, quote, a solution to the whole matter, unquote. He assured Dulles of the reasonable attitude of his government. Dulles conducted a private round of negotiations among the Germans, French, and Belgians to try to resolve the impasse over the Ruhr occupation. Dulles found French cabinet minister Louis Loucheur, who he knew from the Reparations Commission, very bitter as regards to the Germans, unquote. He told Dulles that the Germans had played into the hands, quote, of extremists like Poincaré and had in fact proved that these extremists were right when they had said that the moderates were indulging in false illusions, unquote. The Belgian prime minister had railed that, quote, only a more socialist government can make the necessary sacrifices and take the necessary action against the great industrialists, unquote. Besides passing messages among the European leaders, Dulles warned them of all of, quote, disintegration in Germany and political problems which would disturb all Europe for years. He devised the strongly pro-German solution of paying reparations with a tax on beer, wine, and tobacco, instead of delivering valuable coal to the French. He wanted the Germans to reindustrialize while German consumers paid the country's reparations. His ideas satisfied German demands but did nothing to placate the concerns of other Europeans. Dulles also suggested that the money collected for reparations be applied in Germany, quote, for internal use, as long as the Reparations Commission shall be satisfied that Germany is loyally seeking to carry out her fiscal reforms and make deliveries in kind, unquote. In return, Germany would try to get back to normal, as long as the occupation troops were reduced in number. Dulles made a constructive effort to break the impasse, but he had no official standing, and so he sailed home a week later, concluding to his wife that the trip was, quote, an interesting but not financially profitable time. The profits would follow. Dulles's proposals of the year before were revived in April 1924, with Germany faltering on its reparations payments and French troops still occupying the Ruhr. The Inter-Allied Reparations Commission sent Charles Dawes and Owen Young to an international committee to stabilize the mark and balance the German budget. And I'll just make a hat tip to David Underdown, who's pointed out the importance of the Dawes and Owen Young committees in, putting us in this right now. I mean, this is 100 years ago, but this process of working through the onerous reparations ordered in Versailles and turning them into a way in which Germany could rearm is really the core of what we need to know in American history as well. And that Dulles, Bush, Hamburg America line connections to today are, well, they're there if we're willing to do the work and point them out. So, and this book is really, really helpful, as I hope you agree. Okay, with Dulles as his special counsel, Dawes, chairman of the committee, arranged for the United States to rehabilitate Germany by using Dulles's suggestion of a trustee, calling it a transfer agent, to apply reparations payments within the country. The levy was pared from $55 billion to $33 billion and made payable in marks, not foreign currency. As a further boost to German stabilization, the J.P. Morgan Bank spearheaded a $200 million international private loan. Keynes had recommended that the United States participate in rebuilding Germany, but the Dawes Plan relied far too much on private loans rather than on Keynes's idea of government aid. From 1924 to 1931, Dulles arranged more than $1 billion in loans, which he liked to say were issued under the Dawes Plan. When the State Department forced him to be more accurate, he revised his statement, quote, I do not mean under the control of the organization set up by the Dawes Plan, but that it was in accordance with the general recommendation contained in the Dawes Plan that capital should be supplied to German manufacturing interests, unquote. So this is it. Dulles has figured out a way to get the government's oversight out of the way, finance the whole thing privately, and he's got $1 billion in it already. Hey, Nan's here. Hello, Nan. Good to have you. Okay, a little bit more on this Dawes Plan. Unless pressed, he always preferred his original formulation, which made the bond buying public believe its money was being lent under some official sanction, when it never was. The Dawes Plan initiated an era of German prosperity based on American lending, a disastrous formula which Sullivan and Cromwell vigorously promoted. There it is. Disastrous. The firm organized the very first American bond for a German company, the Krupp Steel Company. Quote, one of the best known and most important steel works in the world, as the prospectus put it. The bottom of the Krupp prospectus, as prepared for the bond issuer J and W Seligman and Company, read, quote, this offering is made in all respects when, as, and if issued and accepted by us, and subject to the approval of Mr. Sullivan and Cromwell of New York. Unquote. For the Krupp loan, Dulles called Leland Harrison, the Assistant Secretary of State, on a Saturday in December 1924, asking casually, quote, if you felt you could, in your talks with the newspaper men, do anything to soft pedal this talk, unquote, of renewed dissension between France and Germany. He added that the issue was coming out the day after next. Harrison was incensed because the department had issued a circular asking to see foreign loan applications before they were approved to monitor the export of American funds. But as Dulles knew, the department had no authority to stop the transactions. Dulles claimed he thought the circular applied only to governmental loans. Harrison reminded him, quote, several members of the syndicate were well aware of the department's desire to be consulted in such matters. Dulles offered to go to Washington on the midnight train, but was told he could not get a reply on Sunday. On Sunday, Dulles changed tack and tried to get around Harrison by calling the department's economic advisor. After being very apologetic, he admitted that the bankers wanted State Department approval because, quote, they felt that the disagreement between the Allies and Germany as to the evacuation of occupied territory would injure the sale of the notes. But they still planned to go ahead on Monday. The Krupp bond was successfully issued on Monday without State Department approval. 10 days later, the department sent Sullivan and Cromwell a copy of the year-old circular with the tart comment, quote, inasmuch as the financing in question was not brought to the attention of the department, this department does not feel in a position to express any views on the matter at this time. Dulles wanted to avoid State Department scrutiny of whether the German factories were producing military hardware in violation of the Versailles Treaty. I'm going to read that again. Dulles wanted to avoid State Department scrutiny of whether the German factories were producing military hardware in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Uh, Is that treason or not? I mean, it's incredible. And This whole power structure is still here. Sullivan and Cromwell had accepted Krupp's own pallid assurances that, quote, all special equipment for the manufacture of war material has been destroyed, except for certain pieces of machinery, unquote. A year later, Dulles wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine, quote, few bankers would wish and fewer still would dare to ignore the expressed desire of the State Department that it be consulted, unquote. However, by avoiding the State Department, he had already ushered in the era of private loans to rebuild Germany. It was a telling start to an incredible era when Sullivan and Cromwell dominated a major segment of American investment. Banks competed with each other to get the firm to find them German loans. Within the first year, Americans lent $150 million to Germany, a sum that worried even the German government. It warned against, quote, indiscriminate placing of German loans in the American market, particularly when the borrowers are German nationalities and the purposes are not productive. The concern was well founded. The prospectus for a Prussian state loan approved by Sullivan and Cromwell noted, quote, the entire proceeds are to be applied by the state for revenue producing purposes, unquote, though a third of the money was being used to improve harbors, which are hardly a revenue producer for paying back loans. When the State Department issued more warnings, Dulles called it, quote, a pretty poor effort that ties up the several matters upon which I have been working. He wasted no time neutralizing the department by ingratiating himself with its loan supervisors, starting with Robert E. Olds, the undersecretary, using the Council on Foreign Relations, a prestigious New York club of businessmen and academics interested in foreign policy. Well, that's an interesting short definition of the famous CFR. Dulles invited Olds to a dinner in New York. This is your networking at the top of the chain. Within 3 years, Olds had joined Sullivan and Cromwell as a partner to head the Paris office in what the New York Times called, quote, a significant increase in the ranks of American ministers of foreign finance. While the State Department privately alerted bankers and lawyers of its concern over the growing levels of German indebtedness, Dulles publicly promoted the loans. His speeches were covered in the newspapers, especially when he praised himself and his colleagues for the Dawes Plan and the, quote, financial and economic revival, which is perhaps the most notable achievement of its kind that the world has ever known, a wise and constructive and firm employment of the financial power of this nation, unquote. Allen Dulles. After one of his foreign affairs articles had appeared, Dulles admitted to a Sullivan and Cromwell partner, quote, in some quarters there is a tendency to criticize my article as representing too much the, quote, Wall Street attitude of wanting to get rid of any sort of restriction with regard to financial matters. Yeah, I'd say that's about right. But let's not forget that this is also the British and ancient empires method. Sullivan and Cromwell supervised endless series of German bonds. They came so fast that errors the firm would theoretically have never tolerated proliferated. Some prospectuses had just not been proofread at all, was probably not surprising considering how frantic the efforts to acquire new loans became. Others were purposely deceptive. A 1926 Bavarian bond prospectus began, quote, Bavaria has an excellent financial history, unquote, discussing the period prior to 1914 when, the year before in 1925, the state had defaulted on its debts. Candler Cobb, a garrulous American with a veneer of cosmopolitan manners covering a base of sheer persistence, worked at Sullivan and Cromwell's Paris office, looking for loans to pass along to bankers. Not himself a lawyer, he roamed Eastern Europe from Frankfurt to Budapest, scouting prospects in an increasingly competitive market where, for instance, quote, 36 houses, most of them American, competed for a city of Budapest loan and 14 for a loan to the city of Belgrade, a Bavarian hamlet discovered by American agents to be in need of about $125,000, was urged and finally persuaded to borrow $3 million in the American market. Unquote. Even Dulles chased customers. The Dulles of the Dresdner Bank in Hamburg wrote him in 1925, quote, "You encouraged me to remind you of the possibilities for placing American capital here, secured by first mortgages at from 5 to 10 years. It is the only object of this letter to bring this matter once more before your eyes, and I shall be very much interested to hear from you in due time whether you have been able to promote interest at proper quarters." Cromwell got into the act once with his typical showmanship and mixed motives. He hosted a visit to America for the Queen of Romania, one of the most beautiful women in the world, who came to launch a successful Romanian debt issue in October 1926. As president of the Society of the Friends of Romania, an organization he had founded after falling under the Queen's spell in Paris, Cromwell sponsored a dinner for 1,000 at the Waldorf, with a glittering guest list that he had published in its entirety in the Herald Tribune. Handsome Sullivan and Cromwell associates were put into blue satin uniforms trimmed in gold and taught to whisper to entering guests, quote, "There shall be no curtsy to the Queen, just a slight hand clasp," unquote. After the ball, which was fully covered in the society columns, Cromwell escorted the Queen, with whom he had a purported romance, on a cross-country tour in a 7-car private train donated by the railroads. Donated by the railroads. Cromwell never revealed his attitude toward the firm's active solicitation of bonds, but his support of the Romanian effort implied no more enthusiasm for the whole practice than his defense of Mrs. Frank Leslie's will had implied personal support for the women's suffrage movement. Yet he was instrumental in the success of the movement when he made sure that the estate of Mrs. Leslie, who had inherited a magazine empire from her husband and had greatly enhanced it, went to, quote, "My friend, Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt of the city of New York. It is my expectation and wish that she turn all of my said residuary estate into cash for the furtherance of the cause of women's suffrage, to which she has so worthily devoted so many years of her life." Cromwell had written a clause in the will that, quote, "Should any beneficiary or next of kin of mine contest this will, I hereby direct that he or she shall thereupon be deprived of all interest in my estate," unquote. But Mrs. Frank Leslie's son sued both the estate and Cromwell as an executor to throw out the will. The son tried to make the case that Mrs. Leslie was both illegitimate and the daughter of slaves. He failed, and the suffragette movement got the money that helped get women the vote in 1919. It was not that Cromwell sold Romania to the Americans so much as that he sold himself to the Queen. Normally, Sullivan and Cromwell found borrowers to pass on to the bankers, who then used the firm to supervise the loans. It willingly put its prestige on the line with clauses in the loans like the one for the Saxon State Mortgage Institution, which claimed, quote, "It is believed that the adoption of the Dawes Plan has rendered extremely remote any attempt to enforce such charge against either the revenues or assets of the states," unquote. In other words, they're going to all the money that comes in under the Dawes Plan is not going to affect the revenue or assets of the states themselves, the states of Germany. Such reassurances helped build a huge structure on an increasingly shaky foundation. From 1924 to 1931, Sullivan and Cromwell handled $1.15 billion in loans to Germany and Europe, as well as $250 million to Latin America and $139 million to Japan, a total of more than $1.5 billion. To handle its accelerating volume of European work, the firm started a law firm in Berlin, Albert and Westrich. Heinrich Albert had been a German spy in the United States before it entered the war, buying up industrial ceramics to cripple the United States chemical industry. I never knew that. Heinrich Albert of Albert and Westrich had been a German spy in the United States. His attaché case, which he accidentally left on a New York subway, revealed subversive activities like smuggling rubber to Germany in coffee sacks and raising money for emigre Germans, quote, to create an army of hyphenated voters to wage political warfare against the government, unquote. Sounds like the Bund. Albert was deported amid loud objections to what the New York Times called, quote, impudent activities. After the war, he was German Secretary of State and a key means of access to major German borrowers. As a high German government official, Albert left the legal work to his young associate, Gerhard Westrich. To the bankers and to Sullivan and Cromwell, the loans produced no risk once the banks had sold the loans to unsuspecting buyers among the general public. In the defense of his client bankers, Dulles claimed, quote, it is the function of the bankers to pass upon matters of lending money, and they should be held primarily and exclusively responsible. It was a heavy responsibility, but as Dulles knew, it was moral, not financial. And since he himself had bought no bonds, he had nothing to worry about. Wow. Well, that is the conclusion of part one of the book. You can see that the kindling and the flames of World War II are in large part the product of the Dawes Plan and Alan Welsh Dulles's attitude of just exploitation, of winning without regard to morality, without regard to the future consequences of acts taken to enrich himself and his clients, without regard to what's going to happen. And does he even care that the world is now being set up for the most destructive war in human history? Well, we know that. We know he doesn't care. And we have to know that the people that are the Alan Dulleses of our day today, they don't care either. They don't care one bit if this world goes up in a third world war. They don't care. Their plans are made. And they've also got plans for what happens afterwards. And with, 8 or 9, you know, billion people out of the way, the world is a lot easier to control. I was listening to Harley Schlanger this morning on his update at schillerinstitute.com and therushorganization.com, and it really is chilling. Somebody with his historical reach to say that, NATO countries are now expanding to a worldwide NATO. Japan has made a treaty with Great Britain whereby Britain can send troops into Japan, Japan can send troops into Britain, completely unprecedented. The preparations for a war in Asia continue, but the partnership announced this weekend between the EU and NATO is chilling. The lack of any involvement of the United States Congress in deciding whether we're going to go to war or not is chilling. And the fact that our financial system continues to run on fumes, and the fumes are generated by war. And the war is just going to get worse and worse. And the people, such as Alan Dulles, who have no conscience, no sense of morality, are the ones that are running the show. So, it's time to put two and two together, folks. We won't get out of this alive unless we wake up, get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. All right, we'll be fighting along with you this week. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Harley will be with me tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. And don't forget to check out our podcasts at McDuff Lives Podcasts. You can find them on Spotify and any other podcast service. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow.